In the 10 years that CAS has existed as a business school, a lot has changed for the world of charities and philanthropy and giving. Professor Paul Palmer has been looking at this. Paul, you're famous for talking about the lessons of history. What are the lessons for the charitable sector?
For the last 10 years, the lessons for the charity sector is that the next 10 years are going to be nothing like the last 10 years. We've had a time of plenty. The voluntary sector was very much at the forefront, particularly of New Labour's policies in relation to the welfare agenda and the involvement of civil society. The next 10 years, obviously, we are dominated by how we deal with a rebalanced economy, putting growth in the economy and severe cutbacks. It would be fair to say that in the last 2 years of budget cutbacks, the voluntary sector has suffered more than any other part of any of the economies. Basically, the workforce has been reduced by over 10%, but at the same time, the pressure on charities to now pick up, if you like, where the state has further receded, right? So we have a double whammy of pressure on the voluntary and philanthropy sectors.
You mentioned the years of plenty under New Labour. Implicit in that, this is actually a very political issue, isn't it?
It is to a certain degree, because I think it would be fair to say that a large part, there was, if you like, a payroll vote of the voluntary sector that became highly dependent on government funding them up to 100% of their budgets. And it's been particularly those organisations, particularly ones who aren't in the forefront of service delivery, but equally importantly in delivering capacity building and other infrastructure services to the sector, that have suffered most.
What are the lessons that the economic cycle can deliver to charities and to the philanthropic sector?
Well, the key word is diversity, and diversity is an interesting word, but in this case I'm using it to imply diversity of funding. The key messages are that a charity that is dependent on any just one source of funding is going to be quite under pressure. Even if, for example, that source of funding is, for example, an asset base of investment management. And other members of the faculty are much better to qualify to talk on investment management than I am. But in many ways, low returns, for example, in cash, which is a traditional asset class held by charities, and the assumption that for the next few years we will still see negative returns on government bonds, which is the other asset held by charities, means even those charities that are grant makers, the ones who give the money away, who have an asset base, not asking the public for money, not asking the government for money, not asking corporates for money, are equally suffering in being able, at the same time as they're seeing their own returns on investment plummet, or into their traditional classes, should they move into more riskier asset classes or into equities, right? But at the same time, right, the pressure on them to, if you like, up their giving, right? Bearing in mind that the state in particular has fallen back in its giving to charities is a key issue there.
Charities, by their very nature, are very often working with the neediest, the most vulnerable people in society. What does that mean at a time like this, at a time of economic hardship?
Well, as I said before, what it means is that there is greater pressure on their services at the same time as their own resources, right, and their ability to meet those demands are being cut back. Right? We've also got a wider issue here, of course, which is that inevitably we're looking at a rebalancing, if you like, of the welfare state, a further move away from, if you like, the Beveridge plans and much of what people assumed, was the cradle-to-grave existence, and the reliant instead. But this leaves a very clear question. I mean, as Mitt Romney, for example, made the observation in his somewhat sardonic speech that 47% of Americans, I think, were never paid in and 53% did. So you've similarly got an emerging picture in the UK of a classic 1/3 of society, which is basically has completely missed out. 1/3 of our society, to quote the old Will Hutton study, is pretty much holding on, and 1/3 have done extremely well. Now, the real issue is that if government's not going to, through taxation or whatever, rebalance those inequalities, can philanthropy take its place? And that's going to be the key issue. Can the wealthy, the 1/3 that are doing well, be persuaded and be encouraged to, if you like, donate their money to charity to help that 1/3 who aren't doing so well? And the trouble is that after the debacle of the budget earlier this year, where the most stupidest of all government messages were sent out, that fundamentally philanthropy was some form of tax avoidance. Tax avoidance is where you're retaining an asset. charity giving, you're giving away an asset, and that's a fundamental issue that I failed to see the government getting to grips with. And it was a great disappointment to see a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, which should really have known better, getting itself and sending out these wrong messages. So we're really seeing potentially the whole charity brand in many ways under attack here.
A last cheeky question. Are you hopeful for the future?
I'm always hopeful for the future, and charity is always hopeful for the future. When people say why I'm always interested in it, this is a sector that has lasted longer than any of the others, right? Sometimes, actually, when the chips are down, charities perform even better. When adversity happens, and the resilience of the charity sector to go through periods when they've been accused at one extreme of withering on the vine of the welfare state in the 1940s, to others where they were criticised as ineffective and out of date by the Webbs in the previous century, back to the 16th century we can go. Charity history is full of times like this. The great advantage and wonderfulness of this sector, which is linked to civil society, linked to democracy, linked to a free state and a free people, is that charity always bounces back and continues.
Professor Paul Palmer, thank you very much.